Introductions for use of the radio. This is underwater.
We begin our dive at the very stern of the Morrell. Swimming up over the railing, we see a flagstaff and the dim outline of a chadbird emerging from the darkness.
Yep.
We are going to continue our dive, going to the left side or the port side of the ship. There's a series of 4 doors that we're going to see on this level. The first door we come to went down into the rudder room. Here you can see the ladder. Going forward a little farther, we find the pantry. And as you look in there, you can see the cooler door ahead of you. The next door that we came to, which was only about 12 feet up, was one of Dennis's favorite on the ship, the galley. This is where they served him his meals. As we look in, you can see one of the cupboards ahead of you starting to come off the wall. The area where they sat. And looking off to the right, we get to see a couple of sinks and some dishes stacked in a cupboard all the way back. Going forward, there was one more doorway that led down into the boiler room. As we continue forward, we come to a ladder that led to the roof of the cabin area. Once up here, we look down and off to the right, and we see a chain ladder. This was used to put over the side of the ship for loading the lifeboats. As you can see the bright lights right here, this is me filming the name on the side of the ship. Following the ladder down, we come to a wheelbarrow. And right behind the wheelbarrow was the rear mast, which had fallen down. You see the ladder still attached to it. This was the skylight for the engine room. Swimming aft, we find an opening, which we can drop down into. Once inside, one of the first things you see was that steel I-beam. In a moment, you'll see a chain fall that's attached to it that could be used to make repairs on the engines. Dropping down, we find some stairs, and they led us to the first catwalk that went around the engines. At the base of the stairs, we were astonished to find the engineering certificates still up on the wall. Next to it, we found a chalkboard. This was for the ballast tanks. Continuing down, we find the throttles for the engines. And on this beam, the main engine chadbird, or telegraph. Behind it, we could look up and see the engine gauge panel. go around some piping and start to head up and out of the engine area as time was running short. This is a ladder to the smokestack. Notice how the ambient lighting you can see is turning the water bluer and bluer. This is a steam whistle that was nearly 8 feet long. And we see the very top of the smokestack itself. Well, we continue our journey back up, having to make safety stops to decompress for the deep dive that we had just made. We're going to move another 5 miles out in the lake, and there we're going to dive the bow of the Morrell. The bow of Morrell can be a little different dive. As you see, it has more cabin area and superstructure and comes up higher off the lake bottom. We start our dive by the second mate's door. We drop down this ladder to what's called the spar deck, or working deck of the ship. This is the dunnage room. Dennis said that the men would gather and play cards at the base of the steps here. Going all the way across the deck to the right, there was one doorway open that was called the crew's hall. Dennis's room was all the way down to the right. As we look in here, we see a lot of the partitions have delaminated and are fallen to the floor. This was the bow of the ship where Dennis stood watch. That's called a steering pole that went out in front of the ship. We're going to drop a level and look at some of the cabins along the sides. This was the third mate's cabin. Again, you can see how some of the wood has delaminated and fallen down. However, we see a chair still sitting by the radiator. Fan on the wall. We think this was one of the bunk lights. And we see a shower and shower curtain. We come around the partition, and it gives us a better view of the bathroom area. Coming out of the third mate's room, we're going to swim around the front of the ship. You notice this is fire station number 1 right here. And continuing around, we come to the starboard side. This had the captain's office on this side, and we'll go in and take a look. We see some red Nelga-hide chairs laying on the floor. The captain's intercom. Next to the intercom, we see this GE fan that still looks like it could be in running shape today. And we make a quick exit of his room. Go up a flight of stairs. And this was the pilot house. Notice that part of the starboard door is missing. And we enter the pilot area. Where you see all this clutter on the floor, there was an opening there where the captain could come right up through his office into the pilot house area. Place where a certificate was once on the wall. Directional finder. Gyro repeater. The helm minus its wheel. Another directional near the ceiling. And the radar. We're going to go out the port side of the pilot house. From here, we're going to jump to the roof of the pilot house. On it you can see some wiring, and this was the mast for the VHF antenna which had fallen down in the storm. Behind it, you notice the forward mast. This was a convenient spot for us to moor to and go up and down on our dives. This platform that you see right here had some lights on it, range lights, but now as you can see, it's the home of many burbot. Burbot are a type of freshwater cod that live in our Great Lakes. Continuing up, we find another platform for another light. And a floodlight for the spar deck. When we dive the Morrell, we are struck by the contrast on how peaceful she lies on the bottom today compared to the violence that accompanied her on her sinking. This was the sea for the Cambria steamship line. Through knowing Dennis Hale, the Morrell has become more than just another rusting hulk lying forgotten in Lake Huron's depths. Our excitement in diving her, however, is tempered by the feeling of sadness for the men who lost their lives on the Morrell and their families. We regret that we will never know the Morrell as she was when she sailed the lakes, or share a quiet word with the good men who crewed her.
Pause it after the credits.
Pause it after the credits. We'll turn this on to the
Well, the Morrell,
Dennis, right up, close your mouth.
Oh, okay, yeah.
There we go. Yeah,
I joined the crew of the Morrell in 1964. She had been laid up in Erie Bay for like 5 years, along with a couple other ships, and business warranted taking her out again. Apprehensive when I got aboard, didn't know what to expect, but I really soon fell in love with sailing. It's something, once you do it, it stays in your blood, it seems. I still get excited. I'll be going out next year on the court, and I'm all excited about doing that. But the sinking, I guess the best place to start is we were at Taconite Harbor with our last load of the season, and we were heading for Lackawanna to Bethlehem Steel, about a 3-day trip. And we were everybody was really hyped up about, tying it up and going home for the winter. And we were about a day out of Lackawanna when we received word that one of the other ships, the Lehigh, had gone down with boiler problems and went into Erie, Pennsylvania, and that we would have to make her last run. So needless to say, the crew was pretty well bummed out about it. I had a car in Lackawanna because I lived in Ashtabula, Ohio, which is about 3 hours away. And when we got there to tie up, we found that there were 2 ships ahead of us, which told me I had about 24 hours before I actually had to be on board again. And so I checked with the first mate, my boss, and told him I'd like to go home, take some of my belongings home. Another fellow, John Grosse, from Erie, Pennsylvania, wanted me to take him with him. And the first mate gave us the okay. I was home probably, we had about 24 hours, I figured. We were home for about 20 hours, and I had a friend of mine go back to Lackawanna with us so he could bring my car back home afterwards, because didn't know where we'd finally end up. And I picked up John Grosse, and by the time we got to Lackawanna, we had missed the boat. I could see the Morrell's lights just clearing the breakwall as we pulled in. And if I missed the ship that time, I would lose a lot of money. I'd lose about $7,000. So I got on the ship, I went to the Coast Guard station, I got on the ship to shore, and called the captain, and he told us to catch it at Mullins Fuel Dock in Windsor. So we went back to my house, spent the night there, and got up the next morning early and took off for Windsor. And when we got to Windsor, the Morrell, she was still at anchor. She was at anchor because of high winds. They said that if she tried to come in, she'd just drifted right into the dock because of the high winds. So they were still at anchor. Well, between us, we had enough money to go out and grab a sandwich for lunch. And about that time, later that day, some boats started coming in that were downbound, going on to Lake Erie, and they stopped to fuel up and probably went to anchor, further down there, like Lake Erie. And we went aboard and grabbed a bite to eat from their galley. I tried to sleep that night I tried to sleep down below the coal dock in the locker room on one of those wooden benches, but that didn't work out too good. And finally the Morrell came in the next morning, about 7:30 in the morning. I worked the 4 to 8 watch, 4 in the morning till 8 in the morning, and 4 at night till 8 at night. So my watch was just about over when I climbed aboard, and they told me to go ahead and go to bed. John Grosse, however, had to go to work. I was awake at about 3 o'clock that afternoon to stand my watch, and went back to the galley, took a little bit of razzing from the crew for missing the boat again. That wasn't my first time. Well, I'm a sailor. And then at 4 o'clock I went up to the pilot house, and I got ripped by the first mate and the wheelsman as well, and things settled down. We were just coming onto Lake Huron, and there was no problem. The weather was good. We had no problem with weather. At 6 o'clock I relieved the wheelsman, and he went back to get a bite to eat. He came back probably 6:45, and then I went back to eat. I did notice there was a little spray coming over the bow, but nothing I hadn't seen before, nothing I would be concerned about. Well, I went back and had a bite to eat, and I got back up to the pilot house. It was probably 7:45. Watch was just about over. After the watch, the first mate asked me to run back to the galley and grab him a bite to eat, and so did the wheelsman. So I went back to the galley. Again, I walked down the leeward side. You have a windward side, and the other side is a leeward side. I walked down the leeward side to keep from getting wet. And I got back forward. It must have been close to 9 o'clock before I got back up and gave them their meal. And like I say, the weather, I still wasn't concerned about it. I gave the first mate his meal and stopped to talk to the wheelsman. And he said, "Oh, Dennis," he says, "easy trip. We'll go up to Taconite Harbor, load this Taconite up, turn around, 3 days we'll be home. We'll be in Lackawanna. Another 3 days we'll get off the ship and go home." And I said, "Yeah, but you know what they say about the witch of November?" Or something to that effect, I said. And he said, "Well," he says, "listening to the weather reports all night," he says, "nothing coming in. We're all right." I said, "All right." Well, his room was on the main deck, on the spar deck, as was mine. As I went through down the companionway, his door would be the first on the right. Another fella, and all with me, would be the second door, and my door would be the third door back. And then the next door would lead to the windlass room, where they had the windlass for lowering the anchors. I went to my room, stripped down my undershorts, grabbed a book, jumped in bed, and I probably read till 10 or 10:30, shut off my bunk light, and went to sleep. Later that night, I was awakened by a loud bang. And in my slumber, I just assumed it was the anchor bouncing on the bow or something. So I rolled over to my right side, facing a bulkhead, a wall. And as soon as I did that, there was another loud bang. And this time, all the books came off my bookcase. Never happened before. So I figured, well, if it's going to get that rough, I better get up. I reached overhead to turn on my bunk light, and it wouldn't come on. Right then and there, I guess my heart quickened a little bit. I knew something had to be wrong. Well, I pulled the curtains away from my bunk, and as I did that, the general alarm sounded. Well, at first I tried to turn on, well, yeah, I told you I tried to turn it on. But as I pulled that away, the general alarm sounded, and I could see small sparks from where the hammer was hitting the bell. Well, I jumped out of bed, and I reached overhead, and I found a life jacket to put on. Only had undershorts and life jacket on at this point. Opened the door to the companionway that led to the main deck. And as I did that, Al Wimmy came out of his room, the middle room. And he got to the opening that led to the main deck before I did. And he said, "Oh my God, oh my God." I said, "Al, what is it? What's going on, Al?" And he didn't respond to me, he just headed back towards his room. I actually stepped out onto the main deck. And as I looked towards the stern, the ship was hogged. This being the main deck, it was like that. I couldn't see the stack or any lights. I could see lights coming up where the deck ended, but I couldn't actually see the rear of the ship. I knew the bottom was gone out of it. I walked over to the crew's work hall on the port side, and there were 3 guys in there. One guy, Norm Bragg, he was on the Steinbrenner when it sank. The other 2 guys were deckhands. This was their first year of sailing. We talked briefly about what was going on, what had happened, and what to expect. And I know I looked to Norm Bragg for some guidance, and I'm sure the other guys did too. After all, he was in a sinking. Well, he said, fellas, he says, we better go back and get on the raft. Well, the raft was probably a little further than from here to that wall, probably the length of this room from where I was standing. Well, I didn't have any clothes on, and I wanted to go back to my room and find some more clothing. However, that first loud noise I heard, or the second one, severed all the electrical cables coming forward, and there was no lights forward at all. Now the stern still was under power, still had lights. So when I stepped in that companionway, it was like being in a cave. And so what I did, I stuck out my right hand, and I counted the doorways till I got to the 3rd door. And I stepped inside, and it seemed like it was even darker in there. And I searched around for clothing, but all I could find was an old Navy SEAL pea coat I had. And I put that on over the life jacket. Went back out on the deck and walked down the starboard side, leeward side, to the raft. As I'm walking, it must have snowed or ice, because there was ice and slush coming up between my toes as I walked back. When I got back there were like 4 people on the raft. The kid I took to Erie, John Grosse, he had a rope, and he was tying himself down to the raft, as was Norm Bragg. Well, I didn't want to be tethered to anything. I didn't know if I'd have to move real quick or if I could snarl up in something. I think the main reason I didn't want to go back up that deck, though. And so I didn't bother doing any of that. It didn't take long till all of the forward end crew was either on the raft or around it. There were a few men missing. A full complement was 32, and we had 29 men aboard. I know the fellow that shared a room with me was not on the boat. He had quit. And I think the other 2 guys came from the stern of the ship. But it didn't take long till all the crew from the forward end was either on the raft or around a 21-man raft. It was about a maximum 5 foot wide, maybe 8 foot long at the max. But they say 21 men because they had a rope that ran around the outside, and that was men in the water hanging onto the rope as well. Well, it was the noise. There's conversation around the raft about other ships in the area. The sister ship, the U.I. Townsend, was said to be within 15 miles of us. And to make sure that once we got into the water and back onto the raft, something I didn't even think about, to make sure we fired off some flares. And there was other conversation, but I missed a lot of it because of the noise. The laboring of the engines, steam escaping, steel rubbing together, and the wind. That night we had 65-mile-an-hour winds, 30, 35-foot seas. Being in the trough to the sea, I'd add another at least 5, maybe 10 feet to that 30, 35 foot sea. Water temperature was 44, and the air temperature was 33 degrees. And I just, the noise was just, there were so many things capturing me, I guess you could say. I did see lights on coming from the forecastle deck on the bow, and I looked up there, and it was the third mate. He had a flashlight, and I thought he was fumbling around with some keys up by his door, and I kept thinking, get back here with the rest of us, safety in numbers, let's get back here, And about that same time, I heard a noise coming from the stern of the ship, and I looked towards the stern, and they still had lights. And I could see an oiler standing in front of the after cabins, a guy by the name of Don Worcester, a big guy from Maine. And he was standing there looking forward with an oil can in his hand. And I'm thinking then, I wonder if they got the SOS or the alarm in the back, And I heard another noise, and I looked away from him for a second, and then I looked back, and he was gone. And then I heard another noise, and I kind of looked over my left shoulder to the starboard gunwale, where the deck meets the side of the ship, and the main deck was starting to tear. That's 1-inch overlapping steel plate. And it just ripped real slow like a piece of paper. And every once in a while, I believe it hit a rivet, and the rivet would go flying, and you see a puff of dust from it. Well, I watched it tear all the way to the hatch combings, and then I could hear it tearing in between the hatch combings. And then it got to the port side, and I was facing the port side. And if I looked to my right, I was facing the bow section. To my left was the stern. And when it got all the way over to the port side, I watched the two sections separate. And the stern section came abreast of the bow section, still under power. And she was coming right at us. Now if I looked over my left shoulder, I was looking right into Lake Huron. It got so close that I became very frightened it was going to run right over us and wipe us all into the lake, And I closed my eyes and I held onto this bar I was sitting on. And then all of a sudden, I found myself in the water. Didn't know which way was up. Forgetting I had a life jacket on, I let some air bubbles out and followed them to the surface. Once to the surface, I looked around looking for the raft. Now the raft itself, let me sit down. The raft itself is equipped with a carbide light, and when it's a canister about that big around and about that high, and there's a pin attached to it that's welded to the deck, and when that life raft goes off, it pulls that canister off that pin, and when that carbide gets wet, it burns white hot. So I was looking for this white hot light from someplace, and I couldn't find it. And then finally, I found it between two waves, and I started swimming for it. Well, let me tell you right now, if you're ever in a situation like that, you have a life jacket on, a pea coat on, like pulling a darn bus behind you. I just, I kept swimming and swimming. I never thought I'd catch up to it, but finally I did catch up to it. When I first saw it, no one was on it, and by the time I got there, Art Stojek and John Grove had climbed aboard, and they helped boost me aboard. I told them we had to get into the safety compartment in the center of the raft. Now this raft, it's made out of 2x4s with a superstructure. The deck is all 2x4s, and you got spaces between the 2x4s, and then you got a 2x4 on one side going all the way around it for a lip. And then below that is a superstructure, metal superstructure, with metal drums in it. 8-foot metal drums. I don't know if they're filled with something buoyant or not. And that's it. There's no protection from the elements or anything. But I told these guys we had to get into this compartment. About that time, another guy came up, Charles Foshbender, and we helped pull him aboard. I explained to him, we got to get in the compartment so I can shoot off some flares. Art Stojek, I believe he was in shock already, because all he kept saying to me was, Denny, what are we going to do now? All I have on is pajamas. And it was a real whiny voice, and he kept saying it over and over and over. And finally I told him, I said, hey, all I've got on is a pair of undershorts, a life jacket, and a pea coat. I said, but just hang in there, we'll make it, I told him we had to open this compartment. We opened it up, and I reached inside and I grabbed the parachute flares as well as the flare gun. Everybody else was reaching in there for this, that, or the other, I fired off a flare. Kind of disappointed. It seemed to go up about 30 feet, and then the wind caught it, and it was gone. I fired off 2 flares like that, and I closed the hatch up, and I grabbed the parachute. I grabbed a handheld flare before that, and we all laid down. I closed that hatch, and we all laid down, and I lit that flare. And we kind of, I know my fingers were already numb, and we kind of got around that flare to try and get some heat from it. But those flares, they don't put out any heat, they just put out light. I can remember Charlie Farshbender, I was laying on my right side, holding that flare over my leg, and he said, don't let that, there's some kind of liquid that comes off of it. He said, don't let that stuff drip on your leg. It'll eat a hole through it. I really didn't care. You know, that was heat. You know? Once that flare went out, the other guys remained laying down. I got up and I opened up this hatch looking for anything I could find that we could use. While I'm swimming to the raft, I'm thinking, you know, there's a canister of storm oil in there. It's a can about, well, probably that big around at one end and about a half inch around at the other end, and it goes into what's called a sea anchor, which is a canvas bag. And the idea is to put the canister in this bag. There's a little screw on the end you open up so the oil flows out, and then you throw this overboard, and the sea anchor is supposed to hold you in place, and this oil is supposed to keep the seas down around you. But I mean, you know, seas like that, a little canister of oil is nothing, you know. But what I had thought about doing was when I got to the raft, I wanted to get that canister out, and I wanted to put as much as I could on my body and try to hold in some body heat. But by the time I went to get it, one of the guys had already thrown it overboard because he didn't know what it was. Another guy threw over the sea anchor because he didn't know what it was. So I couldn't do that. But after I got everything out of there that I thought we'd need, I reached up to close this hatch, you know, and I saw this glitter. And I looked up, about like that. And it was this wave. The carbide light was shining on the foam on the top, and that's what caught my eye. And the wave itself had to be 30, 35, 40 foot maybe. And it scared the heck out of me. I figured I had to I closed this hatch real quick. I leaned forward and rolled over to my left side, anticipating this wave to crash down on us, possibly killing us and wiping us all off the raft. But that's not what happened. Instead, we went through the waves. We went through them all night. You know, people say, well, you know, Mr. Hale, what was the worst part of the whole thing? I can't think of a good part. It was all I mean, it's like getting your arm chopped off. Well, what was the fun part? And going through those waves, I don't know what the rip dimension is on a 35, 40-foot wave. I know that after that light went out, after that first wave, you couldn't see them coming. And just all of a sudden, you'd be underwater, solid, hard water. And I'd be underwater so long that different spots on my lungs felt like they were burning. And that burning would spread. And then you break through the back side of that wave, and that 65-mile-an-hour wind would hit you at 33 degrees, soaking wet. And it just felt like your skin was being pulled out. As soon as we break through that wave, the first thing you hear is everybody gasping for air, and then screaming out as that wind hits you. Well, the boat went down at 2 o'clock in the morning, and I would say the storm was over maybe at 3:30. But the waves, every wave wasn't a 35-footer. You know, they might hit one, and then it'd be calm for a while. Then all of a sudden, you might go through 2 of them, or maybe even 3, and then it'd be calm, and then another one, or another one. It was really, the waves were really bad going through them. I can't, there's just no way of explaining that to you. Conversation, there wasn't much conversation. I mean, there's nothing to talk about, really. You're just hanging on, waiting, hoping somebody will find you real soon. I talked to John Cleary. He was laying on his face with his hands up around his head. And I told him, I said, John, I said, roll over on your side and curl up in a ball. Try and expose as little of your body as you can to the elements. And he wouldn't do it. I think at that point he was probably in shock too. He told me, I can remember him telling me, he says, Denny, he says, if I don't make it, he says, you get a hold of Kathy and tell her I love her and I'm sorry. I said, we'll make it, don't worry about it, you know. And, you know, that's the only conversation I can remember having.
after we once laid down. Didn't know if we'd make it till dawn. You know, another thing you go through out there, you've probably gone through it, somebody in here must have gone through it at some point in their life. It's called loss of faith syndrome, where, you know, I didn't know if I was going to live or die. I wasn't in any pain. I just wanted it over. Just wanted it over. When we were going through those big waves, after the first wave, I actually let go of that bar I was hanging on to so I could get washed overboard. So I figured in the water I might make it for 3 minutes, 4 minutes, something like that. And the only problem was I'd let go of that bar and the wave would lift me up off the raft. But with the way the guys were placed around me, Charlie Foshbender was behind my knees, Art Stojic was at my back, and John Cleary was right in front of me. And I couldn't get washed overboard, which is what I really wanted to happen. I just wanted it over. But come dawn, and I looked at John Cleary. And dawn, when I say dawn, there's a sliver of light about that big between the sea and the sky. And the sun was just starting to come up. And as it got brighter, I looked at John Cleary, and there was like a white foam coming out of his mouth. And I jabbed him. I said, John, I said, are you all right? And he didn't respond to me. Well, I jabbed him and called his name several times, and he didn't respond to me. Behind me was Art Stojic. I took my elbow, and I jabbed him. I says, are you okay, Art? No response. I did that several times, and no response. Charles Foshbender was behind my knees, and I kicked him. I said, Fuzzy, I said, are you all right? He says, yeah. He says, I'm hanging in there. And I said, these other 2 guys are gone. He said, yeah, I heard you talking to him. We had a little conversation, but not a lot. I asked him how he was doing. He asked me how I was doing. And we just didn't have much conversation. I spent most of my time in prayer. I spent almost all of my time in prayer. But you know, when I prayed for the guys on the raft and their families. My other shipmates, I didn't know if they had been picked up. As far as I knew, maybe they had been picked up. But I prayed for them and their families. And of course, my family, constantly praying. And then about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I felt Fuzzy moving around a little bit. And he put one hand on my hip and the other on the deck of the raft and lifted himself up. I was faced out to sea. I couldn't see anything. And he said, I can see land. I said, how far away are we? He says, we're quite a ways away. He said, but we seem to be drifting in that direction. And I said, how long have we been out here now? He said, 12 hours. I said, what time is it? He said, it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon. He was dressed and in the pilot house. He was standing watch when the thing broke in half. We talked a little bit about being home. His wife was from St. Clair, and she used to kind of follow the ship wherever it go, you know. We'd be in Toledo, she'd be in Toledo, just to spend a few hours with him. And then many a time I went out and had a beer or dinner with him. And very, very close couple. So we talked about our families as well. And then he lay back down and we grew silent again. Like I say, I was in prayer most of the time and always trying to figure out some way of doing something so we could be found. But there's nothing you can do. By this time, you know, I was having trouble moving. I didn't know if my joints were freezing on me. I didn't know what it was. It wasn't until probably 4 or 5 years ago that I found out that when you're freezing like that, the blood comes from your extremities and goes to your core to help keep your organs warm. I didn't know that. So what I did, I kept my hands in my mouth most of the time so that I could use them to fire off the flare gun if I had to. Or there was a rope on the back of the flare gun I would stick it in the water and suck the water off it. Well, I needed my hands to do that, so I kept them in my mouth, not knowing, you know, what was going on. Later that day, I felt Fuzzy moving around again, and he put his hand on my hip, and the other on the deck of the raft, and lifted himself up. He says, you know, he says, we're really close. He says, I can see a forest. He says, I can see a forest now. He says, a lot of big boulders in the lake by the shore. He says, I don't know how we're going to get to shore, if we can even get to shore. And he sounded kind of funny. I said, are you okay? He says, you know, he says, it kind of feels like my lungs are filling up. I says, well, is it something you can cough out? Well, he started coughing and he died. 10 years ago, I couldn't talk about that. I didn't feel like I killed him, I guess maybe I felt like I was the instrument of his death or something by telling him to cough. But after a number of years, I finally went to a psychologist, and he told me, he said, well, he was already dead before he boosted himself up. He says his lungs were freezing, and that's what happened to the other guys on the raft. Their lungs froze. You know, the last thing I wanted was to be alone on that raft. And when he started coughing and died, he fell with his arm around me, and I was totally alone then. And I wept over him dying. I just, he was a good friend. Yeah, I thought we would make it, you know. I would say that was probably around maybe 4 o'clock in the evening. Eventually the raft did turn around before dark to where I could see on shore, and I could see all these large rocks. Fuzzy did tell me, he says, before long, he said, the bottom of the raft will be hitting on the bottom of the lake on the beach. He said, we'll feel it hit. And I did feel it hit. And, you know, the raft turned around, I could see on shore, I could see a forest, and that's all I could see. And before long, it started getting dark. And as it got darker, I couldn't see anything on shore, but I could see buoys out in the water. And so I knew we were somewhere near a shipping channel. I didn't know we were in Canada or the United States. And I figured, well, you know, this has got to be my last day of life. It's got to be, because you know, everybody's gone but me, so I mean, how much longer can I hold out? But later that evening, looking on shore, I saw some lights come on from a house, a barn, you know, whatever it was, you know. Well, I had started out with 6 flares, and I used 2, so I had 4 left. So I got the flare gun out and loaded it and fired a round off. When I did that, the gun broke right where it bends, and the barrel fell and hit me in the head. And I picked it up, and it was really hot, and I rubbed my fingers all through it, and I rubbed my fingers all over my face and my ears to get that little bit of heat. And then I started yelling like hell, trying to make as much noise as I could so somebody would come out and find me. But and all I wanted to see was a flashlight coming through the woods. And nobody came. Nobody. I figured, what am I going to do now? No flare gun. Well, maybe if I hold the 2 pieces together, load it, and hold the 2 pieces together and pull the trigger, maybe it'll fire for me. That's what I did. It did fire. And I did the same thing with the barrel, hot, you know, trying to warm up. And yelled and hollered, and again, nobody came. I had 2 flares left. And I figured, well, I'll wait until in the morning and wait for the lights to come on, and then after a short while, fire off a flare, and then when those lights go off, fire off another flare. Because they were going higher now, but not really in a good direction at all. I mean, you couldn't direct them. That night, I knew it was going to get colder, and by this time I was, you know, I was arguing with God, praying to die, asking Him. You can pick up an old newspaper and see where in there where I asked why God was punishing me before I died. What did I do that He was punishing me for what I did? And later that night, that loss of faith syndrome hit me again, and I could get up on my one elbow. And I figured maybe if I get up high enough, I could stick my fingers down my throat far enough to where I could pass out and maybe die. And so I got up on my elbow and I curled up my hand and I shoved it as far down my throat as I could. And all I did was gag myself. Oh, what a rush of heat I got through my body. And I did that until my throat was really sore. And I laid back down. And I prayed. That's all I could do was pray. Didn't want to make it through the night. Didn't think I'd make it through the night. But the next morning, you know, I was waiting for some lights to come on in this house. And finally they came on. And I waited. And maybe I didn't wait long enough, and I fired off another flare. And nobody came. Waited till the lights went out. Fired my last flare, and my throat was too sore from gagging myself that I couldn't yell a lot, but I yelled, you know, as much as I could. And again, nobody came. Nobody. Well, I set myself up to thinking, well, this is my last day. Today's the day I'll go. And so I spent my time in prayer. And then it started snowing. I mean, it was really coming down. I would reach over, well, I'll get to that. But it was really, really coming down. And the flare gun, with the lanyard on it, the rope on it, I couldn't find it. I usually kept it between John Cleary and I couldn't find it. So I got up on one elbow and I pulled my collar around on the peacoat and started eating the ice off of it. And I know this has happened to you, probably to some of you, at one time or another, where you're in a mall or a crowded area. I know as a kid, I felt like, if I was in a crowded area like that, I felt like somebody was watching me all the time. Well, as I'm eating this ice, I have that feeling. And I look, and there's a strange looking man standing there. And he looked at me, well, let me describe him. He was, I don't know about height, but his hair was curly, almost wavy, almost to the point of being curly. Very white like wool. He had bushy white eyebrows, a neatly trimmed white mustache. His complexion was like skim milk used to be, with a kind of a blue tinge to it. His eyes were very deep set and forceful. And when he talked to me, the best way to describe it is forceful. He told me not to eat the ice off my collar. Well, I laid back down, and almost immediately I was above the raft, looking down on it. I was having an afterlife experience. Well, I didn't know it at the time, but I was looking down on the raft, and the only light, I was in a dark cloud, and the only light was light being cast upon the raft, and I could see myself and I could see my shipmates on it. And very slowly I was being pulled backwards and turning at the same time, very slowly, very slowly. And the further I got away from the raft, the faster my speed became, and my whole demeanor changed. I wasn't worried about living or dying. I wasn't concerned about my family. I wasn't concerned about my shipmates. I just felt like I was surrounded by love. And as I'm being pulled at a very rapid speed, I turned around and looked in the direction I was being pulled, and I noticed then that there wasn't even a breeze on my face as I was being pulled through this. When I got to the end, well, I saw the bright light at the end, and when I got to the end, I took one step backwards and turned around, and I was in a very vivid green field with a multitude of flowers of various colors. To my left was a man that called me over to him, and he took my hands and he said, "Let us see what you've learned." That really struck me. It still does. What have you learned? And my whole life passed before me, and every time there was a scene, he'd always tell me, you did the right thing there. You did the right thing. Things I never thought were the right thing. And finally he told me I could cross over. But there was a little footbridge, and there was a dip in the terrain. And this footbridge went over the terrain, and on the other side were people, family I'd never met. My mother died when I was born, and she was there. And there were uncles and cousins there. And my mother came up to me and hugged me. She said, "I waited so long to meet you." And I told her I had waited too. But my main concern, really, these were people I didn't know very well. And my main concern was with my shipmates. And I asked about my shipmates, and they said at the bottom of the hill. So I went down to the bottom of this hill. Well, this hill I was on, I know where the hill was. It's in Virginia, where my mother's buried. But I went to the bottom of this hill, and the Morrell was down there, and I climbed aboard. And not really sure of my mode of transportation, but all my shipmates were there. And it was quite a reunion. Everybody was laughing and crying and hugging, and it was just so beautiful, and so much love there. It's beyond words. And then somebody said, "Let's go to the stern of the ship and into the engine room." And we did that, and the entire crew was in the engine room. And it was the same thing. Everybody was happy and laughing. Some were crying, tears of joy. But everybody was very happy that we were together again. Then the third engineer was coming down the ladder, and he looked at me. He said, "Dennis," he says, "what are you doing here? It's not your time yet. You have to go back." And just briefly, I saw my shipmates, and their eyes were very sad. And just like that, I was whipped out of the engine room, back through that cloud, and actually slammed down onto the raft. And I didn't question any of that. I just didn't question any of it. I looked for that the flare gun with that lanyard, and I couldn't find it. And I called out to the guy that came around the first time. I called him Doc. I guess I figured he administered to me, and so I called him Doc, and he didn't reappear. So once again, I got back up on my elbow and pulled my collar around and started eating the ice once again, and he did reappear. And he shook a finger at me, and I can remember his hands. His nails were very rounded. I don't know what that is. His skin was very loose and very translucent. And he shook a finger at me. He said, "I told you not to eat the ice off your collar. You're going to lower your body temperature and die." Well, I laid back down, and I don't know how much longer it was till I was picked up. But I saw the helicopter, and I waved to him, and I saw him land on the beach in the water. And two of the Coast Guardsmen got out of the life raft and walked over to me, picked me up and laid me on top of one of the other bodies, and I started talking to them. And they didn't think I was alive. They thought the wind had caught my arm, was blowing it around. And they asked me if I had any injuries, and I said, "Yeah, I think I have a couple broken ribs." I knew I didn't have any broken ribs. I wanted off that raft. I wasn't gone enough that I couldn't lie. So they put me in a helicopter and laid me on the back and on my back, and I could see a thermos on one of the bulkheads. And I asked them for something to drink, and they said they couldn't give me anything until they got me to the hospital. Well, once in the hospital, I was in pretty good shape. You know, 3 of my shipmates died right on the raft there. When I got to the hospital, my body temperature was still 94. So, I mean, how? I don't know. I had a frostbite blister on my left foot that had broken, but no gangrene. I had skin pulled off a couple fingers, and other than that, nothing. They asked me about my ribs, and I said, "No, I'm all right." I said, I was laying on a steel bar in my armpit and one arm above my knee, and I just wanted to get off that raft as fast as I could because it was very painful, Well, I saw the sheriff, and I called him over, and I asked him if he called my wife in Ashtabula, Ohio. And I gave him my phone number, and he took about 3 or 4 steps away, and I called him back and gave him my area code. That night, I was in good shape. That night, they said they put anything that would hold hot water in bed with me, trying to warm up my body. A few years ago, I talked to one of the doctors that took care of me, Dr. Oakes, and he said, on Harbor Beach, he says, we never had any problem with cold water survival, so we really didn't know what to do. So I called the Ford Hospital in Detroit, and they told us to warm you up very slowly, be very cognizant of blood clots. And he said, I asked him, I said, well, at what temperature will his heart stop? And they said 94. And he said, well, he's at 94 already. He's still talking. We can't shut him up. Then I had last rites at the church. I'm Catholic. I'm a convert. I converted when I was 13 because I wanted to be Catholic. Well, I had last rites at the church. Now that shakes you up a little bit. That last rites. And of course, I had confession and thought about confession for a while, and wound up calling the priest back again for second. Well, actually, I had 3 of them that night. Anything I had on my slate, I wanted to make sure I got rid of just in case. The next day, officials from Bethlehem Steel came in and interviewed me as well as the Coast Guard. And they eventually sent me a copy of the interview, which was nothing like what we talked about. Father McEcken came in, the priest that gave me last rites of confession, and I started to tell him what had happened to me out there about the afterlife thing. And he looked at me and said, well, Dennis, he says, I don't think I'd be talking about that. And that really crushed me. And just, this was something very beautiful that I experienced. And I wanted to share it with everybody. And it just, it really, really upset me. Well, I was in the hospital in Harbor Beach for about 5 days. And then they drove me by ambulance to Ashtabula. And it was really kind of funny as we're driving up, people were pulling up next to it was I guess it was a van from Ramsey's funeral home. And people were pulling up and waving at me. I was in the hospital in Ashtabula for till after the first of the year. I think it was about the 5th of January I got out, and I was numb from mid-thigh down. Had absolutely no feeling. I can remember my wife and I getting in the car, and I drove her to a convenient mart, and I told her I want to stop over at my buddy's house afterwards. So when she was inconvenient, I got out of the car, and it had been snowing, and I went out kicking the ice off the back of the wheels there. Got in the car, went over to my buddy Norm's house, stayed in the foyer for a few minutes and talked, and went home. Kicked off my boots, and my left boot was full of blood. I kicked a toenail off my big toe. I didn't even know it. That's how numb it was. But I think the really hard part was the mental stress. It was, you know, people ask me about bad dreams. I only ever had 2, and I'm not really sure if one of them was a dream, or if it was something that my mind made up. Because I was laying in bed and I heard this ring, and I looked over to my left shoulder, and it was like seeing the sparks off the general alarm system. And I don't know if that was a dream or I don't know what it was. But I've been able to work. You know, I retired when I was 58. And I couldn't stand it. I had to go back to work. I didn't like it at all. And went to work for a buddy of mine. He opened a glass company. And I worked there until I was 70. And I finished my book. And the book's been out about 3.5 years. In that 3.5 years, I sold just over 7,000 copies now by myself, which is pretty good. And I dealt with all the, you know, there's one part I left out that I usually leave out. And you know, I think maybe now I should tell you about it. It's while I was on the raft and it was snowing, and you know, I was 26. I wasn't used to death. I never really lost anybody. So I avoided looking at my shipmates. And it was that last day, I looked at John Cleary, and he was encased in ice. He had ice all over his hair. His hands were all shiny with ice, and his clothing was all covered with ice. And I guess you know, with all the praying I did, I guess I just went a little berserk. And I got up on my elbow and cussed God, the Holy Family, told them they could all go to hell. I could make it on my own. And then I lay down, and out of love, compassion, envy, empathy, I started chipping the ice off of his hand. And I lay there. I'm a very nonviolent person. And the more I thought about what I had said and what I did, I got back up on my elbow again and shook my fist at the sky. And I said, and don't send your son. This is a man's job. And I laid down and I started laughing. And I knew I was still in there somewhere. But it's always a difficult thing for me to talk about that for some reason. Well, I worked up until I was 70, and I went to work for a buddy of mine at this glass company. Well, I worked for him until I was 70. Then I wrote the book, finished the book, because I had started it earlier. And like I say, I sold a lot of copies. And I'll be glad to take any questions you might have.
Questions? Anybody have a question?
Yes, ma'am.
You say you were 26.
Yeah.
Were your shipmates similar age or?
No, John Cleary was about 20. Art Stojic was in his 30s, and Charles Foshbender was in his early 40s. And you know, you got guys out there in their 60s still sailing today. So I mean, there was no definite age on there. Yes.
After this affair, you said you continued working and later got retired but then went back to work. Well, what did you do after that? Did you continue on
I went to school, became a machinist, and worked myself up to tool and die. Worked at that for about 3 years, and then decided I was tired of holding size on machines, and I retired. And at the glass company, I did just about anything they wanted me to.
Which glass company?
Hmm?
I know there's a lot of glass companies in Ohio. Which one?
This was Aero Glass. You're no longer in business.
Oh.
That's not my fault.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Did you have anything to eat during the ordeal?
Nope. I lost 30 or 40 pounds during that.
You lost how much?
30 to 40 pounds between the time I was picked up and the time I left the hospital in Ashtabula. But when I had this craving for orange juice and beef consomme. I never really liked either one. But I tried to eat when I was there, or even drink orange juice, and I couldn't make it swallow. I just, that's part of exposure, I guess. But eventually I did have a turkey sandwich that tasted like sawdust, and some orange juice and some consomme. Yeah.
Did you ever think about going back on a boat?
Well, yeah. I vowed I'd never sail again. I mean, would you? But in 1999, I was offered a ride on the Roger Blau. And beautiful, beautiful ship. 725 by 105 foot beam. And I thought about it, and I thought about it, and I just couldn't bring myself to do it. And about the time I decided to call them and let them know I wouldn't be going, they called me. And they said, well, you can bring 7 of your friends. I said, oh, well, that kind of changed things altogether. So I invited 7 people I wasn't real fond of, just in case. And we went out, and it was a great time. We had a good time. As a matter of fact, I have something called, I call it Maritime Dessert that I'll be showing you after the question period. And that's the trip on the Blau. I was supposed to go out on the court this year, but the captain retired. But I saw him last weekend at the Maritime Mart, and he's getting me a trip next year on the court. So I definitely will be going out again. Yes, ma'am.
Did I understand correctly, the divers saying that the 2 sections, the bow and the stern, were 5 miles apart?
Yeah, what happened after she broke is the stern section was still under power and traveled another 5 miles. As I'm on the raft, Charles Foshbender had a flashlight. And I looked over and he was signaling these lights on the water. I said, what are you doing? He says, I'm signaling the lights on the water over there, that other ship. Well, the lights were at an angle like that. And you're going to miss half your ship, you're going to go like that. And no water got to the boilers right away. And it was astern the Morrell signaling. And I told him, that's astern the Morrell. I should save our batteries. But it traveled another 5 miles before it went down. Yes, sir.
How deep in water did it sink?
The bow section, you can hit the main mast at 90 feet. And then another 30, 35 feet down to the main deck. The stern section is a different dive. It's in about 205 feet. And they're diving that with trimix. Yeah.
How far do you think you drifted on the raft between the sinking and when you washed up on shore?
Well, they say it was 18 miles northeast of the thumb. And then we drifted right back to the thumb. If you look, I could see the point of arc's light while I was on the raft. And if you look just a little to the south, there's a little alcove in there, and that's where we were. Yes?
What was the actual structural failure in the ship?
Well, needless to say, the storm, for one thing.
What in the ship failed?
It was built in 1906, and it had a high sulfur content, which meant
Brittle.
And with the twisting and bending, they're built to twist and bend.
Mm-hmm.
And breaking from the bottom up, I would say she had support in the bow, support in the stern, and nothing in the middle. And she broke from the bottom up.
Were you in the upbound channel?
Probably, I would say, yeah. Most likely. The winds were coming out of the Georgian Bay. Well, we had 3 winds that night, 3 seas. A wind out of the north, northeast, and northwest, and seas out of the same direction. And people say, why didn't they launch any life rafts? Well, you can't in weather like that. First place, as soon as the life raft hits the water, it's going to get beat up against the side of the ship. I mean, you just can't. Any more? Yes?
Yep, one more question.
I may have heard part of the answer, but have they made any significant improvements in structure from the time that ship was built compared to what?
Oh yeah, when she sank, most of the ships that were out there were built in 1906, 1908, 1912, and all the same type of steel. And the companies were trying to get government subsidies so they could build new ships, but that never came about. But they've built a lot more ships, 1,000-footers, and they've eliminated a lot of ships. I live on Lake Erie, and very seldom we see a freighter on Lake Erie east of Cleveland. Because Bethlehem's not there. Yes, sir?
One last question, then we'll go to the video.
Oh, okay.
We want to give them time to sign books too. Thank you. Go ahead, please.
Aren't some of those old ships still out there?
Well, the Challenger's still out there. She's 106. And this is her last year. I was supposed to go out on the Challenger this year. And,
Now, they cut the back end off some of them
they notch them.
and put a tugboat in there. Is that to meet some rules or something?
I don't know, it lessens the crew. The company can make more money. But, you know, I'm a little worried about being in a storm with heavy following seas, because that tug set's kind of low. So,
Dennis, before we go back, tell them about your foot. What's
My
gone
foot?
on over the years with your foot?
well, I say, you know, I just had that one frostbite blister, but over the years, I've lost most of my toes on the left foot. The only toe I really have is my big toe. I had the one next to it removed about 2 years ago. And I walk pretty good. You know, I don't have very many problems, unless I'm on an incline. And that left foot is down. It tends to make me want to roll over, you know. But I get along pretty good. I've had one surgery on my right foot on 3 different toes. But I won't complain. I don't have a right to complain. I'm not alive, you know. Well, maybe we can squeeze in some more questions later.
Yeah, start the video, but go ahead. Yep, go ahead, ma'am,
Just about
please.
your book. What made you decide to write the book finally so long after this happened to you?
Well, there's a lot to be said. Other people have written about me, but they, you know, that's different. And although it's an autobiography, the only thing I can tell you about me as a child is I'm the kind of guy your parents told you to stay away from. I was kicked out of California when I was 13 for 17 counts of grand theft auto. I tell people I was just trying to learn how to drive. And then I hitchhiked back 3 times by myself by the time I was 15. Well, now the movies, folks. This is dessert.
If we get it up, I'll turn the lights up.
That's
We get the
backed
mic
up a
again.
little bit, but that's okay.
Skip it. I don't want to skip ahead because I don't know what to do.
Here we go. Thank you.
There's quite a long pause between this and the next one.
Oh, there is? Okay, maybe I can find it.
Roger Blau.
There we go.
Accompanied him.
That's Frank Mays.
Okay.
Where'd we go?
I went back a little just because I didn't know if that was the beginning.
That was the beginning.
Oh, I lucked out.
In the summer of 1999, Dennis Hale, the sole survivor of the sinking of the Daniel J. Morrell, was offered the once-in-a-lifetime chance to sail aboard the Great Lakes Fleet motor vessel Roger Blau. Accompanying Dennis on his trip was Frank Mays,
This is
survivor of the
1995,
sinking
you're
of
going
the
back out
Carl
to
E.
the...
Bradley in 1958.
1999.
You're going
One
out
of
to
the
the
production zone, Jim
No,
and
we're
Pat
taking a
Stair,
trip.
Sorry.
and Tim and Joan Jewell. Former Morrell crewman Harvey Batman Hayes, and Great Lakes folk singer Dan Hall. We felt fortunate to be sailing aboard a fine ship like the Roger Blau, although you can see
Can everybody
we
hear?
had to rough it. The captain worked us hard, making
You
us
want to
walk
just narrate it,
the
Dennis?
galley 3
Well,
times
there's
a
not much
day.
I can say, you know.
On a ship
Maybe
like the
if I turned it
Blau,
on.
often the crewmen have to wear
His
many
narrative is
hats.
pretty good. I don't follow that.
For the most part, the trip was uneventful, although Denny did have his moments. He got a little nervous while we sailed through a storm on Lake Superior, but managed to convince Jim and Pat that a little ice cream would make everything better. We asked Dennis and Frank to share their thoughts about the trip.
Hi, I'm Dennis Hale. I'm aboard the Roger M. Blau, somewhere in Detour in St. Mary's River. I was aboard the Daniel J. Morrell 34 years ago when she sank, and I was the only survivor. At that time, I vowed I'd never sail again. And up until this trip, I held true, but I felt I had this one dragon I had to slay, and I've done it, you know. And I've enjoyed the trip very much. I was very apprehensive at first. I didn't know if I could really do it. I felt it's something I had to do for myself. And I've enjoyed myself. I've had a good trip. I had some problems off and on with different noises. We were in a storm for a while. That kind of worried me, and the wind kind of bothered me. But I think I'm over it now. I'm in good shape. I'll do it again, I'm sure. But right now, I'm standing in my old station on the front of the bow as a watchman. This is where I used to stand going through the rivers. And it feels kind of comfortable to be here. My name is Frank Mays. I'm out here today on the motor vessel Roger Blau.
He survived the Bradley
I've been
sinking.
on this ship for 6 days.
So he's one of the 2 survivors.
This is the first time I've been back on a
Great Lakes freighter in 41 years, as I was on the Cowley Bradley when it sank in November of 1958. So this is quite an opportunity and brings back many, many memories. And another one of my dreams come true is that I did get a chance to wheel the Roger Blau under the bridge when we were headed towards Gary, which was another great experience, as I did wheel on the Great Lakes.
While sailing back from Gary, Indiana, we wrote a song about our trip which we sang for the crew. And now we're going to inflict it on you.
We're the guests who don't know how we came to sail the Roger Blau. Why ask these silly questions now? We're on our way to Gary. Way, hey, we're on our way, the guests of Captain Larry. He's the Duke of the Great Lakes Fleet, sailing down to Gary. We came aboard below the Sioux, didn't know quite what to do. The owner's liquor saw us through. We're on our way to Gary. As through the stormy seas we plow, aboard the mighty Roger Blau. We're glad she's not some third-rate scow. We're on our way to Gary. Way, hey, we're on our way, the guests of Captain Larry. He's the Duke of the Great Lakes Fleet, sailing down to Gary. We didn't sleep the second night, for they were loading taconite. We left 2 harbors at first light. We're on our way to Gary. They fed us steaks and pies and more, delicacies and sweets galore. Now we can't fit sideways through the door, rolling down to Gary. Way, hey, we're on our way, the guests of Captain Larry. He's the Duke of the Great Lakes Fleet, sailing down to Gary. Sarah makes our beds and smiles. She always goes the extra mile. Little Red Riding Hood's her style. We're on our way to Gary. The watchmen are the wheelsmen too, doing all they're asked to do. Utility men through and through. We're on our way to Gary. Hey! Way, hey, we're on our way, the guests of Captain Larry. He's the Duke of the Great Lakes Fleet, sailing down to Gary. The engines are the chief's great pride. He takes their bulkiness in stride. You get too close and you'll get fried. We're on our way to Gary. The engineers toil down below, working where few dare to go, doing the things that we all know will bring us safe to Gary. Way, hey, we're on our way, the guests of Captain Larry. He's the Duke of the Great Lakes Fleet, sailing down to Gary. No pay, no breaks, and no respect. They toil in engine room and deck. Tuition bills are all they get, the cadets of Traverse City. The deckhands heed the boatswain's roar, the gatemen send the load ashore. Then Roger Blau heads north for more, sailing up and down to Gary. Way, hey, we're on our way, the guests of Captain Larry. He's the Duke of the Great Lakes Fleet, sailing down to Gary. Now, the company wants to cut the crew, saying each hand can work for 2. Please don't strike till we reach the Sioux, just get us back from Gary. The mates are friendly, brave and true. They brought us safely through the Sioux. Without the crew, what will they do? No more trips to Gary. Way, hey, we're on our way, the guests of Captain Larry. He's the Duke of the Great Lakes Fleet, sailing down to Gary. We had some fun here with the crew. We hope that they enjoyed us too. We all can't wait till next year's cruise, when we go back to Gary. Hey! Way, hey, we're on our way, the guests of Captain Larry. He's the Duke of the Great Lakes Fleet, sailing down to Gary. Way, hey, we're on our way, the guests of Captain Larry. He's the Duke of the Great Lakes Fleet,
That's the captain salute.
They're planning trips for you guys right now.
Army's on board.
Shut it off.